Um, First off, it is amazing how the this process, this period, slavery seems to be brought into everything, and that's certainly true. Your book is right about that. It's by far the most important thing, and people are jumping at every opportunity on every little issue. Like I said in the recorded lecture about the statue on top of the Capitol, that people are jumping at every issue and making it a slavery issue. So it is amazing that this happens. Is one of the reasons it's perhaps the most studied period in American history. This period until Reconstruction is. But that's not the only time it happens. And an awful lot of times, other times in American history, it becomes the one overriding issue becomes lumped in with other smaller issues. Well, not smaller, but other issues become lumped in with the overriding issue. I'm thinking particularly of the Cold War, where even things like civil rights, which civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, you couldn't be any more pro-American than civil rights campaigners asking for their rights under the American Constitution. Yet many of them were branded as communists and agents of the USSR. Now that seems silly to us now, but in 1950 or in 1955, certainly by 1960, any criticism, anything that might be construed as criticism of the United States was seen as, well, that must mean you're pro-Soviet. It's because there was this great deal of tension, and it forces people to make these. It's almost as if it forces people to make these extreme arguments, which they do. And I don't know if we're having that now. I don't. There doesn't seem to be just one issue that everyone is lumping everybody into. Maybe if you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, you get, but it's just not. There's nothing now. I don't think that's quite as big as slavery, or certainly not as big as slavery, and not as big as the Cold War either. But the Cold War is the major other time I remember this happening. Of course, it happened in the founding period when there were disputes between patriots and Tories. But this is certainly the most intensive and has the most debilitating effect on American life at the time. So let's see who's here. We'll take question one. This is, I guess, you, Kenzie. Yeah. Oh, whoops. Kenzie is chatting. Okay, so there's the Missouri Compromise, right? Don't get confused. Remember, there are a number of compromises. Oh, sorry, more people are coming in. There are a number of compromises or sort of agreements. What else is there? Don't confuse the Missouri Compromise, which is 1820. It's really the first. Kenzie's right. The Missouri Compromise is really the sort of the first major concession to slavery. But don't get that confused with the Compromise of 1850, which also, confusingly, is largely centered around Missouri, or Missouri is a big part of it. What's the Missouri? What's the Compromise of 1850. Well, first of all, because you're right. The Compromise of 1820 is the Missouri Compromise 1820 stood to balance slave states and free states. And then between 1820 and 1850, there are all these sort of continual agreements on various things. What leads up to the Compromise of 1850? What is the Compromise of 1850? Is everyone else following in the chat so they can see what Mackenzie says?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't forget, you can consider things like, quite easily consider things like the fugitive slave law, as a compromise to slave interests, as a sort of, well, I don't want to say cave in, but that's really kind of what it was. Kenzie's written here, the New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory were given permission if they wanted to be free states or slave states. Republican Party promised the rise of anti-slavery coalition, but fortunately the voters rebuked it. The Compromise of 1850 was a variety of bills that were passed after the Mexican-American War. Yeah, this is where really the concept of the best way to explain this is this concept of popular sovereignty. That's where states, local states, new states choose what they're going to be. Okay, but I think it's fair to say between 1820, but especially as in 1840 and 1850, in the 1840s and 1850s, there's a whole raft of things. Again, there's the Fugitive Slave Act, there's the Kansas and Nebraska Act, and a lot of these things, including I think the Compromise of 1850, what they end up doing is postponing the Civil War, and it would be impossible to determine whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, postponing any war is probably a good thing, because in the case of possible agreement, but it's very clear from the long lens of history that the country is bound to have some sort of civil war. Okay, so in other words, one of the things that is very, very important is really to realize that the Civil War isn't sprung on us. The Civil War isn't sprung on the country. It's not as if everything is kind of okay or the tensions are mild, and then once Lincoln is elected, that's a final straw, and southern slave states go nuts and fire on Fort Sumter. And no, it's building up to something like this. And the North, by the way, and especially the Republican Party is just as strong as opinion of anti-slavery opinion is just as strong as pro-slavery opinion in the South. You might admire them, as a matter of fact, the early Republicans and especially the radical Republicans, for saying, they could very easily, Northerners could have just ignored the South and just said, as yes, okay, below this certain latitude, we can have popular sovereignty, but above it we can't. They could have easily compromised that way and kept compromising that way, but the anti-slavery coalition and the anti-slavery rhetoric was very strong and very powerful, and didn't go away. Like I said, one of the things is it pushes the other side into becoming more extreme in their own way. Okay, who else is in this group? Cassie here? Oh, actually, there are more people here than I thought because some people gave me. Hang on, I got to expand this. Oh crap! All right, anything else about this? These compromises? Obviously, they don't ultimately in the end they don't work. Although each compromise at the time sort of is promoted as this will prevent war, sort of like Europe in the 1930s. Well, not promote war, prevent war. Okay, now here's a fun question, because you have not only a new political party, but you have all these other political parties and sort of strands of political party, the fraying edges of parties that are dying, like the Whigs. What did various political parties stand for in the 1850s? This is let's see. This is Abby, Katie, Ben Myers, Ben there. No, okay. Well, Abby, shoot.
There were quite a few political parties throughout the 1850s. First was the Whig Party, which was first sort of made up of a coalition of middle class to wealthier people. And they strongly believed in the Protestant culture and sort of federal government sponsored improvements to the country. However, they weren't too big on the idea of racial equality, but however, they were anti-slavery. And then the Democratic Party sort of avoided slavery talk, but they wanted to expand the nation through the idea of white supremacy and sort of uniting people through that idea. Even though the Whig Party was anti-slavery, it wasn't an overly crucial issue to them. So that then created the Liberty Party, who wanted to end slavery, especially in the District of Columbia. They wanted to end the interstate trade, and they wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery into the other states. But their downfall was sort of that they weren't overly supportive of women's participation in politics. And then there's the Free Soil Party, which was created for more moderate kind of voters who supported the anti-slavery movement and the end of the expansion of slavery into other states. And then there was also the American Party, which was known as the Know Nothing Party, and they made a name for themselves mainly through the anti-immigrant movement against, I believe it was Catholic Germans and the Irish.
Yep.
But when somebody asked about the party's activities, they pretended to know absolutely nothing about them.
Yeah, they would say, I know nothing. Yeah. Well, I don't know if they actually said that, but that was the idea, that you don't tell people it's like Fight Club. The first rule of the American Party is you don't talk about the American Party. I don't know, do you even watch Fight Club anymore, the movie? Maybe you don't get that reference. Anyway, yeah, if you were approached about the American, because they were afraid that there would be infiltrators. So the joke became the Know Nothing Party. I know nothing about that. And so people started to call them the stupid party because they were know nothings, but that's where that originally came from. You're right. Sorry, Abby, I interrupted you there. I wanted to get one Fight Club references before the end of semester.
There was really just like one more, which was the Republican Party. And they came to be known as an anti-slavery group who was against the expansion of slavery. But that's pretty much all of them.
Right. Now, notice what you have here is a range of opinions. Free Soilers, after all, are anti-slavery, but they're not willing to go to war, not necessarily willing to go to war for it. They believe the way to eliminate slavery is to have the country follow along on a free soil basis, and that defeating slavery in the economic marketplace was kind of the way to go. The idea that you can prove that agricultural production won't suffer with the abolition of slavery, and we're showing this by the extremely productive farms in the northern Midwest and stuff like that, and that slavery only survives because it's antiquated and pre-industrial, and everything like that. And then you have Liberty Party, stronger anti-slavery parties. So there's a range, and that even the Democrats who are split, because there are the Northern Democrats who are certainly white supremacists, most of them, but some of them are white supremacists and anti-slavery, if that makes sense at all. But the Southern Democrats are totally wedded to slavery. It's by far the defining notion of their sectional part of the party. So it couldn't be more complicated, right? It just couldn't be more complicated. Whenever there are lots of parties vying around, things get very complicated. Since the death of Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party, we haven't really had a third party that actually made much of a difference in presidential elections. Anyway, the Dixiecrats sort of did, but so we don't know what that's like to have lots of different parties running around. Technically, now we do have parties. There's a Libertarian Party. There's I don't know if the Democratic Socialists are a party. I mean, there must be a Socialist Party of America. I don't know. I don't know for sure what it's called. But the range is there, but the range kind of doesn't matter. You see what I mean? The range of opinions in the 1850s matters a lot. Sorry, Abby, I'm turning that into a lecture again. I didn't want to do that. Who else is here for your group? By the way, note what Josh has written in the chat. Again, that's again to remind everyone the Missouri Compromise is the 1821, brings in Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and then the Kansas-Nebraska Act that really more or less establishes popular sovereignty. And the Missouri, the 1850 Compromise is different, even though that is a lot battled a lot over because of Missouri itself. So a lot of people get the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 mixed up. Okay. By the way, let me just ask you, just out of curiosity, I mean, it's a bad time to ask this because of COVID. I guess all this kind of student activity shut down, but what's college life like politically for students nowadays? Do you have college Republicans and college Democrats and the college Green Party, the college Libertarian Party? I don't really know. College Republicans and college Democrats were going in my day, and I presume they still keep going. Do they have these kind of organizations on the Greensburg campus? They probably have them on the Oakland campus. I don't know.
I know they have
Yeah.
like minor clubs, but like I don't really hear much about it.
We have a college Republican and Democrat club, but I also haven't really heard much about it other than when they send out an email at the beginning of the year recruiting.
Yeah. Well, maybe not. It's not as big as a deal as it was. Well, certainly, I mean, it wasn't a big enough deal in the early 80s when I went to college, except that the Republicans were having a sort of revival among young people. So I guess the Republican club was active. But it's student politics in the 1960s and 70s was a big deal. I guess it's just not anymore. Anyway, so again, the key here is that the range of opinion is so important among these political parties, but that they all had a definite stand on slavery and what should happen to slavery. Different range of opinions on how it should be attacked or overcome, but they definitely had a slavery policy position, more or less. Don't get me wrong, that's not like the European parties where they have actual policy papers and things like that, but written down stuff. But there's definitely the Free Soil Party is different from the Republican Party and stuff like that. I shouldn't have asked this question. This is question number 3. What was more significant, Dred Scott or the Kansas-Nebraska Act? I don't like these questions, these sort of like Olympics question, who wins the gold medal for being more significant, Dred Scott or Kansas-Nebraska? Because they're both extremely important. But in some ways, these little debate questions are kind of ways to get into the nitty gritty of why these things are so important. So Noah, I think you are the lead dog here. Noah, who else? Maybe that's it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody showed up again today.
Okay. Well, the other thing is going okay. It's not going great, but the discussion boards, I'm not able to keep up with it, but people are putting their stuff in. But it's almost like rote. They just dump their answer and then walk away. Anyway, go ahead now.
So I felt that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was more significant because without the exposure that Kansas was going to become another pro-slavery state, then the newly formed Republican Party wouldn't get the boost that they needed for Lincoln to eventually win the 1860 presidential campaign.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. The Kansas-Nebraska Act has more of an impact on the ground than the Dred Scott decision does. The Dred Scott decision has a terrific, that is big, large impact on the ground. Don't get me wrong. It's just that it isn't. Perhaps it's not as immediate, and it doesn't bring into focus, what will become Bleeding Kansas. The Dred Scott decision is more ideological. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is more practical. This is happening right now. But there's got to be more to it than that. No,
Well, I would also add that because of the number of militants and different militia groups that went out to Kansas and started attacking federal agents, I feel like that's really one of the starting points of the Civil War before Lincoln was even put into office and the southern states seceded. Because without this attacking against the federal government and against the Union, we wouldn't really have the foundation for the rebellion to actually start up, because we would see that people weren't willing to actually fight for things that they believed in, whether it's right or wrong morally.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. The interesting question is how much do the Bleeding Kansas events sort of embolden Fort Sumter people? You know what I mean? I'm just wondering how I could look up whether anybody in the Bleeding Kansas battles actually then goes out to Fort Sumter. It's probably too hard to figure that out. Because Bleeding Kansas, the Kansas border wars, or whatever you want to call them, in the mid to late 1850s is a mini Civil War, right? What else?
We also had the John Brown revolt that happened during this time that took place at Harper's Ferry, which was a federal weapons arsenal. So that's just another point that people were attacking federal installations.
Yeah, it's gotten to the point where pro-slavery people are moving in from Missouri to Kansas to rig the vote, if you will. And of course, the violence starts. And then John Brown's raid is also violent, and John Brown's raid and the celebration of John Brown as this great moral abolitionist really pisses the South off. And it's like, we have these firebrand wackos up north. If we don't get rid of slavery, they're just going to kill us. So we have to fight. It becomes the argument for so many Southerners. It's one of these human truisms. Violence usually begets more violence. People are almost I don't know, itching to hate people and itching to want to be on one side or the other. And these things certainly don't help. Okay. Let's see what else. You were the only one. You're the only. Okay. What about the conflict over states' rights? This is who is here? Mia is here for this group. Is that right, Mia? Mia, are you there? Deep Space Nine, can you hear me? Yeah, we'll start us off then. Let's see who else. Jaden, Morgan. Some of these people may have dropped. Yeah, so how do the conflict over, sorry, okay. Sectional difference when the U.S. mostly about slavery grew larger in discussion as the country's leaders, this is her on chat, argued whether to allow slavery to expand in the West, meaning each new territory, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, now that's true. That's absolutely true. But this question specifically asks about states' rights, and you're on the right track here. But remember this one of the things that popular sovereignty as a concept does, and when popular sovereignty is sort of encased in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it gives a boost to the states' rights idea. This idea that it's not just a sectional or regional thing. Yeah, okay, the whole South is a slave South, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when Kansas is debating over, when a specific new state is debating over whether it should become slave or free, is not worrying about Nebraska, or it's not worrying about what will become Utah or the Dakotas or anything like that. I think, me and you may disagree with me, the sectional differences actually start to become more focused into state differences. This is why, for instance, North Carolina doesn't join the Confederacy right away, and Virginia doesn't join the Confederacy right away. They still think they have their own special state interests that are different from their sectional or regional differences. But the idea of statehood and states' rights get really enhanced with bleeding Kansas. By the way, what is the anti-slavery what do the anti-slavery people say about bleeding Kansas and about what bleeding Kansas tells us about the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Isn't this kind of obvious that they say, well, look, this popular sovereignty thing sounds great. Okay, great. People get to choose. But because slavery is such a big and awful deal, they just end up fighting. Popular sovereignty, we're going to have, every time we have a new state, or we're going to have a bleeding Kansas, we're going to have a bleeding Nebraska, a bleeding Colorado, bleeding Wyoming, a bleeding whatever. Popular sovereignty, was the Republicans especially argue this because they're very into the republic as one thing. Are we going to have, every time we admit new states, there's going to be a mini civil war? So the bleeding Kansas and the states' rights over that come up over that, there's a very powerful argument against them. You see what I mean? The argument is that sure, states' rights sounds great, but what it really does is an excuse for pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people to fight each other. So it's not a good policy from the Republican Party, the new Republican Party standpoint. It's not a good policy to follow. It's just going to lead to the endless mini civil wars all the way to the West Coast. Okay, is there anybody here for Group 5? Why did the South secede?
I'm here.
Okay, well, go ahead and start. I'm going to sneeze.
So, bottom line, the South seceded, one, because Lincoln got elected, and two, all of the previous issues that have been discussed today have been building up the tensions to taking slavery away. The North is continuously rejecting the idea of slavery, and people are speaking out, and the South doesn't want that. The South wants to keep slavery. They need slavery for their economy. Without it, everything will crumble.
At least that's what they believe, and that's what they say. Yeah. So the why is it the election of Abraham Lincoln's the sort of catalyst or the straw that breaks the camel's back? Lincoln, after all, seems to be wanting to preserve the Union, and not so much. He's not as on the campaign trail. He's not as much of an anti-slavery advocate as all kinds of other people. He seems fairly moderate, even though he's obviously anti-slavery. Why is that enough to make Southerners fire on Fort Sumter?
This is just a wild guess from what I've read, but
well, then it's not a wild guess. You're taking it from what you've read.
From what I've read, it seems like they rejected the idea that Lincoln lost. They still accepted their party's candidate, celebrating the states that he won, which were the Southern states, because Abe got no Southern votes.
Right. Well, that's one of the arguments. Yeah, it proves that the Southern states, who would eventually become the Confederacy, are different enough from the Northern states that they, the Lincoln Republicans get no votes at all. So that shows to them and to other people that, well, we're fundamentally different, right? I think Southerners are more worried not so much about Lincoln, although they call him all kinds of terrible things, especially after he's inaugurated King Africanus the First and all this kind of junk. There are cartoons of Lincoln and as an African, all kinds of things. I think they're more scared of the Republican Party in general, and the reason I think this is because Lincoln, after all, is sort of a moderate, right? But within the party, within the Republican Party, there are all these radical Republicans who are, the Republican Party is as diverse as any other party at this time, and has conservatives who want to end slavery now and uproot the whole system. And it has radicals who want to end slavery now, uproot the whole system and replace it with something else. Then there are conservatives who want to just maintain the Union and hope they sort of take the free soil line that slavery will die out with through economic competition. But that's not what people pay attention to in the South. They don't pay attention to the fact that the Republican Party is, any realistic person is not going to start a war over slavery. It's doubtful that the Republican Party, if the war hadn't already started, would have forced anti-slavery onto the agenda. It's as if you, because the number of radicals in the Republican Party is relatively small, but they make a big stink, and people latch onto them and tar the rest of the Republican Party with the opinions of the radicals. So they say, oh, all the Republicans are radicals. The minute King Africanus the First becomes inaugurated, he's going to outlaw slavery, and it's going to be a war anyway, so might as well start it now while they're not ready. It's as if, how in the Democratic Party there's this group called the Squad, the 4 congresswomen who Ilhan Omar, AOC, I forget the other 2. Anyway, in the House of Representatives, I guess they're on the furthest extreme left wing of the Democratic Party. But you notice how the rhetoric coming out of the other side is that the Democratic Party is run by these whack job Eastern radicals from New York City and all these places, and they're immigrants and all kinds of other stuff, and they're extreme, blah 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 blah. When in reality, there are only 4 of them, and they obviously have no influence on what's going on in policy because nothing they propose gets passed. But that's not important. The important thing is that one party can use those extremists and say, look, they're all nuts. Well, that's what Southerners are doing about Republicans in the North in this period. By the way, nowadays Democrats look to the who was it, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert and say, well, look at the Republican Party. They're all nuts because of these 3 people or however many there are. And so, that's a very common thing to exaggerate from the small to the large, that the entire Republican Party is made up of these extremists, or the entire Democratic Party is made up of these. That's why I think that the non-emotional or the more carefully calculating Southerners are worried about the Republican Party in general, not so much about Lincoln. They hate Lincoln the further Lincoln goes towards the radical Republican side. Don't get me wrong, they absolutely hate him, but it's just not as all of a sudden Abraham Lincoln is like Satan, and that's what causes people to attack Fort Sumter. Sorry, is anyone else here? Skylar, I interrupted you and kept talking there. Sorry.
No, you're good. I said my piece.
Okay. Let me ask you this. There's a very, very prominent historian, very excellent historian named Joanne Friedman. She's from Yale. And she wrote a book recently called Field of Blood. I probably have recommended this to you already. Let me just put it in the chat. And the reason I say this is because it's about literally the violence in Congress itself, in this period. And one of the things that's happened to poor Professor Freeman, because she's very, very good at outreach in terms of volunteering her time to talk to different civic groups, and has her own podcast and has a thing called National Council on History Education, or whatever. So she's very community minded, so to speak. People are asking her all the time now, are like the threats against AOC and the extreme rhetoric that you hear in Congress now, is it like the 1840s and 1850s? Sorry, where after all, Preston Brooks goes up to Charles Sumner and beats him almost to death in the Senate. Is it like that? And she's saying no, because we actually, apart from the January 6th thing, which didn't involve Congress people, representatives and senators themselves directly. The difference is in the 1840s and 50s, our period that we're talking about, there's actual outbreaks of fisticuffs on the Senate floor and on the House floor. Okay, the rhetoric is just as bad, right? People say unbelievably horrific things about the other side or other sides in 1840s and in the 1850s, not dissimilar to what we have now. So I think, although I'm not sure, Professor Freeman, when she's interviewed on the national media about this, worries that the next step is violence on the floor of Congress, and that there might be some sort of insurrection that starts that way. It has this, our period has all the warning signs of that, but of course lots of periods have had all the warning signs of that, and then there's no, technically no outbreak. The 60s were like this in many ways. Do you feel, does it, when you hear about this stuff in the news, does it make you think that, does it remind, or when you read this stuff we're talking about now, does it remind you of what's going on in Congress now?
I always say history repeats itself. Anytime anything big happens, I was like, this sounds familiar.
Human beings tend to do the same thing over and over again. Yeah. Yeah, you could argue that the violence that Dr. Freeman talks about in her book between actual members of Congress fighting each other, and I mean literally, fighting each other. We don't have that now, but we had the January 6th thing. Hang on, my son is calling me. Hang on, something must be wrong. Hold on. Oh Lordy, your generation, he's missing the charger for his phone. And so he interrupts my class to ask me that. That's hardly the bleeding Kansas problem. I always tell him not to interrupt me unless it's a true emergency. Anyway, sorry to diss on your generation, but do any of you sort of, does this ring bells? With what's going on now? I recommend her book, by the way. Sorry, go ahead. Who was that? Noah?
Yeah, I was going to say, I do kind of see a similarity between the like fighting that occurred over in Kansas and like current modern protests and such. It's kind of based on a similar concept, but that's as far as I can think of it right now.
I actually think / hope that the one thing that's saving us from another civil war is the fact that there isn't one issue that is driving the problems now. There are lots of different issues. I don't want to say smaller issues because they're big, but they aren't as big as slavery, and they aren't as dominant as slavery was for the period we're talking about. So if anything came up along those lines, then it might be a different story. The other thing, I mean, this there was also extreme rhetoric during the Cold War. And people were called all sorts of terrible things, and spies and traitors and all kinds of stuff, and a lot of people had their careers ruined, lives ruined. But it never erupted into a civil war or anything like that, because I think that the Cold War was nothing was happening. It's not like the Soviets. Your policy on the Soviet Union determined your agricultural future or the way your economy ran or anything like that. It just wasn't. It's a foreign matter rather than a domestic matter. And the slavery being strongly felt as it was on both sides, and it being a domestic matter, makes a huge difference, I think. Well, but again, we don't want to make too much of these connections, because after all, slavery was the worst thing in American history, and the Civil War was also one of the worst things in American history. So, we don't exaggerate conflicts that we have now into something that big, because they're just not that big. So I always get pissed off when I see media people saying we're hurtling towards a civil war, or using terms that are ahistorical, or comparisons that are ahistorical. But anyway, I'm gonna stop it there. any questions or problems or comments or life-changing events? Like, did you lose your charger for your phone? Okay, well, I will put this up on Canvas as soon as it downloads. Okay,
Have a good day.
Sounds
uh,
good.
adios.